Today I want to cover the dural partitions and the dural venous sinuses as part of our ongoing discussion about the scalp, meninges, and these partitions. To do this, I'm going to use this particular model. There's only a couple of them in the lab, but they're sufficient for what we need to cover, I think. And then you can supplement your study with images from the atlas. This particular model is very nice because it still shows these dural partitions in place, as well as shows into the interior of the cranial fossa, so that will be helpful. In order to understand this particular model, you have to understand kind of the concept behind it. So the scalp has been removed, and then the skull itself has been cut and removed in these wedges, and then the brain has been removed as well. So that's what the model's trying to represent. And so it's left behind this centerpiece of the skull, and then the rest of everything else has been taken out. All right, so the dural partitions, as you may remember from lecture, are composed of those areas where the meningeal layer of the dura has pulled away from the periosteal layer and then descends down into the brain, or into the spaces between parts of the brain, forming this bilayered partition made up of two layers of meningeal dura. A couple of things to understand about these partitions. First of all, there are only really two vertical and two horizontal partitions, and each of these partitions has what's referred to as a fixed border and a free border. The fixed border you can think about as being the attachment of that partition to the part of the skull that it arises from, and the free border is just what the name implies. It's not attached to anything. It just sort of is the border that's not fixed to anything at all. So let me just show a couple of these things to you, and then I think these will make more sense to you. As I mentioned, there are two vertical dural partitions. The first of these is this fairly broad one that you can see here, coming along the midline here, right in sort of the mid-sagittal or sagittal section. Okay, this is called the falx cerebri, F-A-L-X cerebri. The falx, the term falx means sickle, because of the sort of sickle shape, the sort of curved sickle shape that this has. Now notice that on this particular partition, you can see this blue shadow here along the upper portion of it, and then more blue shadows kind of running through it. These are the dural sinuses associated with this partition. Dural sinuses are spaces that are left behind or that are within these dural partitions that occur as a result of the way the partitions are formed. So let me see if I can show this to you a little bit better here. If we look at the end here, we can see here's the end of one of those dural sinuses right there. Okay, so up here you'd have the periosteal dura attached to the underside of the cranium, and then the meningeal dura would be this layer that kind of pulls down here to form this partition here and here. So kind of envision that it starts off like this, and then it sort of pulls off, and as it pulls down, it leaves behind this kind of wedge-shaped space where it pulls away. And that wedge-shaped space is actually a chamber which runs along through here. That is the dural sinus, and it carries, as it turns out, venous blood. So it behaves just like a vein, and that's where the name comes from, the dural venous sinus, because they're filled with venous blood and are essential for the retrieval of and drainage of blood from the brain, particularly in the form of cerebrospinal fluid and some other areas. So oftentimes these are going to be found, well, not oftentimes, they're always found within the dural dural partitions and the dural membranes. Notice that, again, you can see on the falx cerebri here, where the falx comes off of the underside of the skull here, and then sort of has this free non-fixed border down here. So this would be the fixed border, and this would be the free border. In order to pull this out, we would have had to cut it here from its attachment anteriorly. So it attaches on the inside of the frontal bone up here along this kind of internal frontal ridge, as well as on the crista galli. So it attaches to the crista galli here. The free border rests right against the corpus callosum, which is that band of white matter that connects the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. Okay, and then it comes back here, so it's fixed all along the underside here, and then it comes back and has a fixed attachment as well back here on the occipital bone. All right, so that's the falx cerebri. I'll come back and identify the dural sinuses in just a moment, but you can kind of get that sense of fixed border and free border here. The second vertical partition is going to be found deep inside the cranial fossa, and it's much smaller, but it's this small ridge right here that comes up and separates the two halves of the cerebellum. And this one is called the falx cerebelli, this little ridge right here. Okay, like the falx cerebri, it's also sort of sickle-shaped, and like the falx cerebri, it also has a sinus associated with its fixed border. So it's much smaller. The two horizontal partitions are the tentoria cerebelli and the diaphragma celli. Okay, the tentoria, kind of seen in their normal position, is this membrane here and here. Sorry, you can't see this super well. Here and here, okay? These partitions separate the cerebrum from the cerebellum, which will be beneath them. So if I pull this out of here, you can see how that kind of fits in place there, and that membrane there is now would kind of trap the cerebellum and the brainstem into that posterior cranial fossa. Now, in normal life, in real life, where these lines here are, those would be continuous tissue. That's not a normal cut. You have to actually cut that in order to get that to release. So here along there, this line here, that would actually be intact. And so this would be part of the fixed border of the tentoria cerebelli, and this would be the free border here. All right, so that's one of the horizontal partitions. The other horizontal partition is actually represented here by this bluish looking membrane coming across here. This is called the diaphragma celli, and it forms a kind of diaphragm that spans from the anterior clinoid processes here to the posterior clinoid processes back